Okay, so my name is Figge. I'm researcher at the University of Passau, together with Professor Carolin Häussler of the Chair of Organization, Technology Management and Entrepreneurship. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker in our distinguished lecture series on digital platform ecosystems. A warm welcome to Professor Edward Anderson, who is joining us from the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas in Austin. Ed has published in a wide variety of leading journals, such as organization science, management science, information systems research, and is the department editor at the Production and Operations Management Journal. For his work, he has received several awards, such as the J. Wright Forrester Award from the System Dynamics Society. And in his presentation today, Ed will give us an overview of his research on how platforms operate in the world of business-to-business supply chains. As always, we will have a 45-minute presentation, followed by 45 minutes of a discussion. Before I hand over to you, Ed, a short disclaimer for everyone in the audience. We will record this first part, so any question that is raised during this part will also be recorded. And the recording will be made public on the university homepage, YouTube, and other channels. We will stop the recording after the presentation, so the second part, the Q&A session, will not be recorded. You can ask questions via the Q&A feature of Zoom or in the chat. And you can also use the raise your hand button, and we will then enable your microphone and your video so you can ask your question in person. So again, welcome, Ed. You can start sharing your screen now, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Zuerst, es gefällt mir sehr, dass ich Ihnen heute Nachmittag sprechen kann. And now, that's the last I'm going to speak in German because I don't want to betray my rustiness. Okay, so, Dankeschön. Let's get my presentation up here. It looks like you all can see it as I look at my monitor. Is that correct? Good. So, today I am going to be speaking to you, and my presentation is entitled Business-to-Business Platforms, Revolutionizing the Supply Chain. Now, that's a bit of a straw title to create a little controversy. And the reason I say this is that there's this idea out there that platforms are going to completely displace supply chains. And no, platforms are a form of supply chain. Their structure is different, but they are indeed a supply chain. And so the take home today, if you remember nothing else, is that a lot of the research on traditional supply chains is actually a useful lens to understand and give us more insights into platforms. And I believe, for reasons that I will discuss, this is especially true for business-to-business transform. Business-to-business platforms, excuse me, it's still early here. So for today's talk, I'm going to talk about my past research, my research journey, as it were. I'm going to spend probably the bulk of the talk talking about some research that was just published in Information Systems Research in 2020, and that's about investment in platform integration of third parties. I'll then finish up with a brief discussion of my ongoing research program. Time permitting, I will mention some research that I am doing with Professor Figge. And then, of course, we'll go into questions where you will all grill me. So, just some background. I've been in this business for 24 years now, which makes me feel very old. But I started out working on supply chain management, and that's where I come from. Now, mostly what I worked on was how to coordinate personnel. And particularly, I was interested in people like engineers, which we'll come back here to in a moment, and also skilled trades and so on. People take a long time to train. And these type of supply chains, which I call knowledge worker supply chains, they're a little different from normal supply chains in the sense that you don't have any inventory. It's all work in progress. To change any of these work in progress inventories, you have to increase personnel, but they're trained personnel, so it takes a long time, and so on. And then I moved into performance improvement, which I'm still doing work on. Think of it as process improvement, doing better coordination of people who are doing process improvement. And then that kind of led in to distributed innovation. And this is this idea that if you have all these knowledge workers in different organizations, what are the challenges and how can you overcome them as they create new intellectual property? And specifically, since I'm an engineer, I was looking at new product development. I should mention, and this is going to come out during the presentation, that I actually had a real job for 7 years before I went into academia. And most of that was as an embedded software engineer in the automotive industry. So that will come back a bit later. Now, we're interested in mechanisms to do the coordination of these supply chains, and it proves to be actually a very rich question to go into. And I would argue, and in fact, I've got research published on this now, that this also extends to new business models such as platforms. And in particular, as we'll discuss in a moment, this idea of coordination can be facilitated by investment tools as well as changes in organizational structure. Now, let me just set the stage. This is my view of platforms versus supply chains. In a traditional supply chain, the norm, the paradigm is that we have a linear supply chain, and of course I'll use cars. We go from raw material suppliers to manufacturers. They create things like engines. Those are assembled with other parts into cars, and they're given to the retailer. So value is being created at every step along the supply chain. And oh, by the way, money is being passed backwards through the supply chain as well. Let's consider let's consider platform supply chains. There's still supply chains in the sense that you are connecting two different organizations to do a direct exchange of value. But it's mediated by a platform which supports that interaction and between the two sides. And dollars tend to flow through the platform on one side or the other, but there can also be a direct exchange of money as well. But the important point is, this is indeed a supply chain. Its structure is different, but still a supply chain. And then, of course, we have the classic platform ecosystem. Today, I'm going to be focusing on cross-site externalities. Some platforms, or so-called platforms, depending on your definitions, think about same-side externalities. But what I'm interested in is the classic, you have a number of users, that increases the utility of platforms to developers, increases the number of developers, and the utility of platforms to users, which then increases the number of users. And I'm going to use users developers, apps for applications for convenience. But of course, this would apply to all types of platforms. For those of you who don't recognize this, I was trained originally as a system dynamics specialist, and hence I use something called causal loop diagrams. Basically, all it does is it's stating that things like if you have a positive here, it means that the variables are going in the same direction. And the R here indicates that's a reinforcing loop, which means it's either going to be a virtuous cycle that builds on itself, or it will be a vicious cycle that will decline. So, the work I'm actually presenting today. This is from supply chains to platforms, investment and integration with third parties. This is joint work with my former student, Burju Tan, and my colleague, Jeffrey Parker. Motivation. First one is, we know content is king. Content in this case could be applications. In fact, I actually got interested in this because my son, back before I really want to remember, he told me when he wanted a new platform for a gaming console. He said, "It's not the platform, Dad, it's the games." Now, there's a tremendous amount of great work on open versus closed platforms. But having been a software engineer at one time, I know that even if the platform is open, that doesn't mean that seamless integration of third-party supplier content and functionality is going to automatically happen. There has to be work done on the interfaces and various other tools, such as application protocol interfaces, system development kits, support fora, and so on. There are other things as well, but they're essentially fixed costs that are put into place to make it easier for suppliers to create content. Now, why does this matter? It's been shown in the traditional supply chain research that investment, which we call integration investment typically in traditional supply chains, it has had a long string of being decisive in whether a supply chain, a product, succeeds or not. So that is the literature that we're bringing to bear upon this topic. And this is just to show you that this is not just an argument, but companies are investing in creating better integration tools. So here we are back to the platform ecosystem. What we're going to do today, the model I'm going to look at, is if you put integration investment, money that's put into these tools, that will help reduce developer costs, and that will improve the utility of the platform to developers, and then you'll get more developers and so on. And we wanted to understand the behavior of how this works. And so what we did was we looked at the literature that is relatively close. I shouldn't say close, but it's on the platform strategy literature that was extant. And I will tell you, this is just a touch out of date, but we took that platform literature and we combined it with the integration literature in traditional supply chains, particularly the work of Marco Iancidi, but also some work that Jeff Parker and I did later on. And our research questions were the following. So if we can invest in these tools to make things better for developers, make them more likely to participate by lowering their costs, how much should a platform invest in integration to facilitate third-party development, or excuse me, third-party developer participation? And I'll use developer and supplier interchangeably. How should this investment decision be coordinated with pricing on both sides of the market? What are the factors that influence this decision? So we want to understand what elements of the ecosystem are going to drive this investment up or down, or integrate it more closely with pricing decisions, and so on. And we'd also like to know if considering this integration investment puts you perhaps into regimes in which the traditional, I shouldn't say traditional, but the extant supply chain, platform research on pricing may not apply. So, despite the fact I am a system dynamicist and I've done a lot of computer simulation, I can build analytic economic models. And I won't spend a long time in this because I know you're not all economists, but what we did is we built a number of models on this using game theory. And they were linear models. So profit for the developer is related to the number of consumers and how much they have to pay the platform, and also the fixed cost of development, which actually can be reduced by investment in integration tools by the platform. Utility function for the consumers, it's kind of what you'd expect. We also consider standalone value. So if you're looking at an iPhone, you buy the iPhone primarily for the apps, but there's other things that they compete on too. For instance, in recent years, having better cameras. So there is an element of platforms that are related to that. And then the platforms make money on both sides of the market. Later on, we relaxed this to look at symmetric duopolies and asymmetric to get a better idea of how competition comes into play. And we obtained some results. Now, I'm not going to do theorems or lemmas or so forth. We did do were some comparative statics, and a couple of the main results were, one, that if your investment in integration was more effective, it actually increased the amount of investment that you would put in if you were a platform. And that's interesting because normally in economics, if investment becomes more effective, you tend to back off on the investment. But here, because we're in a platform environment, they reinforce each other. Now, what's really interesting to me is the following. And that is essentially this. The typical results, and by the way, one of the persons who derived these results was Jeffrey Parker, who is my co-author, is that if you have a change in the ecosystem that makes participation on one side of the market more valuable to the other side of the market, then you raise prices on that side and you reduce prices on the other. Usually they're looking at subsidies. But the big thing to take from that is that these prices usually move in opposite directions. And what we found is that actually in a lot of situations, if you have integration investment, the prices can move in the same direction. And how does this happen? Well, if you charge a consumer more money, then you can invest in better integration tools, and that's a fixed cost. And hence, while it's partially substitutable with raising prices on the second side, it's a one-to-many investment. You invest $10 million, whether you have 1,000 suppliers or 100 suppliers, the effect on their cost is exactly the same. And that's different from reducing prices, where if you have 100 suppliers, it's 10 times as expensive for 10 if you have 10 suppliers on that side of the market. And so what happens is you can charge one side of the market, create better integration tools, and that makes it easier and for suppliers to enter the market, and you can charge them more as well. And so prices can move in the same direction. Now, to summarize, I gave a lot of that already, but what is important to realize is that this is very dependent on the ecosystem, and particularly that result I just gave, where prices to both sides of the market move in the same direction. It's going to be much more likely if you have a large supplier or developer ecosystem. And I went over these two, but a couple other results that are worthwhile discussing. One is that these results tend to be better if the platforms are more differentiated from each other. So if you look at Android and iOS, they're pretty close, but if they're further apart, there would probably be more integration investment on both sides. There actually is a lot already, but there'd be even more. And also favorable expectations of the ecosystem. I have a number of students who are in a class I teach on startups, and many of them like to start out with platforms. And I always scratch my head, and they all think I'm anti-platform. And no, not at all. I just argue that it's really a high risk, high reward situation, because if the suppliers don't really believe your platform is going to survive, then there's going to be a less of a tendency to invest in or to join. And similarly, in the other direction as well, the side A. And because of that, the bang that you get from investing in integration tools, you tend to have a smaller ecosystem, and there's a bit of a catch-22 there. So hang on to that. Going back to the investment integration on the ecosystem, what happens is, as a result of this, we not only have this one reinforcing loop, but if you have a sufficient number of developers, you also get a situation where platform revenue goes up. So I'm summarizing here. And so too does integration investment, which increases the utility of platforms to developers, and hence you get two reinforcing loops, and essentially integration is acting as a turbocharger. Now, this also captures the fact it might work in reverse. If your number of developers go down, your platform revenue goes down, it reduces integration investment. The utility of platform to developers drops because it costs them more to develop their applications, and hence what you have is an ecosystem that can get caught in this small size trap. Now, I've made a big deal about business to business platforms. And so why have I done that? one of the reasons is that, in fact, the main reason, honestly, is that they're different. And when I say different, it's not an absolute difference. It's kind of like a Venn diagram or a spectrum. But nonetheless, there are tendencies. And one of them is that if you're a customer, so right now I've been talking all about suppliers. I've been talking all about integration, investment, suppliers. Great stuff, very interesting. But as our reviewers pointed out, God bless them, they improved this paper. What they said is, well, what if you have a customer that also has really expensive, it's really expensive for them to join the platform. And in business to business platforms, that tends to be especially true because they tend to have more complex orders. They need to know more. They have a more complex domain in general. They have to have high reliability. Any platform you have has to integrate seamlessly with other legacy software and so on. So what they suggest is, what if you can invest in integration investment that goes to both sides of the market simultaneously? And that has some interesting effects. The fundamental findings that we found tend to still apply. Investment effectiveness is complementary to actual investment. And similarly, the two prices, which DJ Wong actually calls the seesaw principle, doesn't necessarily apply in larger, more healthy ecosystems. But we found some other things as well. And that is, we found out that if the effectiveness of your investment increases on one side, it turns out that's going to create a situation in which not just the investment, excuse me, on that side increases, but so too with the investment on the other side. And yes, prices can increase as well. But the thing is that those investments reinforce each other. And again, because we're in a platform, it's growing a bigger pie. It's not just having to do with divvying up the pie. And in fact, if you go back here, this is not too surprising, because if you put investment into the utility of platforms to users, increases the number of users, and so on, number of developers. And so you get a second turbocharge. And we also think, and this is purely a hypothesis, that this may explain the tendency of B2B platforms to be more industry specific. And the reason for that is because again, this is a hypothesis. We think that what happens is that if you're in the industry, and I'll give an example, there's a company called Twoperiod, which is a platform for companies that provide wood products to companies that buy wood products, oftentimes furniture makers. But for them, the effectiveness of their investment in providing easier, better tools, making it easier for participants on either side of the market to join, is more effective. And hence there's more investment on both sides, and that gives them an edge, perhaps, over a one-size-fits-all platform. I will note that this relates to Germany, is that the federal government in particular, in an effort to make German firms be on the platform map, which hasn't happened too much so far. It's to exploit the highly technical capabilities in general of, it's called the Mittelstand, but a lot of the companies in Germany that make really high quality products, including capital equipment, but other things as well. And this relates back to manufacturing. So again, the traditional supply literature comes in. But because they can do that, the platform knows what each side of the market really needs, much more so than a bigger platform such as MindSphere with Siemens. There's a second finding, and this is a little different from the others, but I think it's worth mentioning. And that is that if you have higher quality developers, in a sense that they can make better software and they're capable enough so that it's easier for them to join a platform for a given amount of integration tool investment. In other words, it costs them less to develop their products because they're, or their apps because they're good at it. It turns out that there's actually more investment by the platform in integration to make it easier for those high quality developers to join. Now, why does this matter? The Internet of Things is literally going to need, even in a small city like Austin, much less the state of Texas, which is fairly large, you're literally going to get into billions of connections. And that's not just because of what's going on in your house, but also there's going to be interaction of your house, your residents, with what's going on in things like sewers and water treatment and traffic, and it goes on and on. Now, the issue is, let's say I'm a manufacturer of a light switch. I'm not going to be a high quality developer. I'm competing on price. And my light switch costs about $1.50 to buy. And it's low margin. So what happens there? Well, the thing is that not only do they not have money to invest, but then the platforms won't invest as much money to make it easier for those light switches and whatnot to participate. And that's highly unfortunate because that's going to leave a lot of products that won't be able to join the platform. Now, what would make that more expensive? Now, it's already expensive enough for a light switch to join. Now, what would make it more expensive is if it has different types of platforms, standards, different types of APIs, which they may. And so this is an interesting situation where policy might come into play. So this is where the government might fruitfully intervene in terms of creating standards, forcing the industry to create standards, which would make it less expensive for all these different thermostats and so on to participate in that Internet of Things platform. And in this case, of course, since you're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of connections, you have a very, very large ecosystem. So anything that will encourage more investment, make it more effective, is going to have a tremendous influence on the success of that ecosystem. I would also speculate, it's not here in the presentation, but I would speculate that'd be even more true of the industry Internet of Things, where you have various pieces of equipment that have sensors on them in factories and sometimes throughout supply chains. So that is my past research. Now, to move on, I have a number of current projects right now that are looking at platforms. And some of them are kind of agnostic on this business to consumer versus business to business question. But a lot of them are influenced by which type of platform you're looking at. So, in more detail, this is fascinating. Well, maybe not fascinating for you, but I've tended not to be all that interested in traditional supply chains, inventories and logistics and so forth. Over the last year, however, I've become very interested in them because of COVID, because it's changing the models of business and how they work. And one thing that's happened is last mile freight. And what that means is once you get to a distribution center for like Amazon, the last mile is what they call actually delivering in a van to your house. And what's happened is the parcel carriers in our country, they'd be UPS, FedEx, but DHL as well. They've been overwhelmed and they've not wanted to participate in doing last mile. And so there's this whole interesting situation which is occurring where platform firms are coming into play. So there literally is something called Uber Freight right now. And there are a lot of competitors as well. And so they've adopted what you're getting effectively is a new business model where you've had a traditional supply chain, but what's happened is you've got a platform adding on at the end of that. And also, this allows us some advantages. Well, it has some disadvantages because once you start doing that, it's potentially possible that fuel consumption will go up. And so we've been looking at how policy can influence that, whether for good or ill, and particularly transform or push over some of this last mile, which we can't do that much about, over into electric vehicles. So the last mile is going to happen. This change in the business model is going to happen. But how do we want to influence that? And part of our influence is maybe to go to higher tech with, for example, electric vehicles, maybe drones. That's underway. I'm also doing some work in physical platforms. And I put that in air quotes because if you look at electric, it says elective vehicles, it's electric vehicles. It turns out that, yeah, there are some physical aspects to it, which since this is a digital class, digital seminar, I won't get into, other than to say that we might see an unbundling of engine and chassis manufacturers from body manufacturers, which has been the norm for large automotive firms in the past 30 years. But what's more interesting is that there's actually a market right now that's been developing in applications for electric vehicles. And that's not just maps. It's also things like, oh, you want a higher performing, higher acceleration Tesla. Well, you can download software that will make that happen. I'm also looking at construction that has less digital associated with it, so I won't even go as far as I did for electric vehicles. Oh, I should mention something with electric vehicles. Normally we talk about multi-sided platforms and we're really talking about two sides, and that's fine. But when you're looking at electric vehicles, I wrote an article recently with Jeffrey Parker, Hemant Bhargava, Jonas Bohm, and what we argued is actually, if you start looking at electric vehicles, especially trucks, you might be looking at 5-sided platforms. And 2 of those would be digital. Then we're also looking at systematic differences between business to business and business to consumer platforms. And these are not binary, but they tend to be more spectrum types of issues, like I was discussing with the need for better interfaces. Now, what I've said so far are primarily a hypothesis. Actually, I believe it. There is a lot of evidence in the trade press about this, but we're going further and trying to catalog what those differences would be in a systematic sense. So that's one stream of research. There are a couple others I'm working on as well. One of which is that we kind of learned during that earlier work I was presenting. Like I said, typically for small, nascent platforms where people don't necessarily expect much, you don't get as much integration investment. And so you don't get that turbocharging I was talking about. But as you get to bigger platforms, you do. And so the question is, okay, we know what's going on here. We know what's going on here. Down here is a startup. Up here is a mature platform. Well, how do you get successfully from startup to successful platform? And to do that, a two-period model, a one-period model. Actually, most information economics models are single period. So they just look at one point in time. What we need to do is look over longer, or I should say, more periods of time, like what's happening every month, because there's probably a dynamic policy that is more indicated. And so I'm doing this because it gets more complex really fast with the computer simulation using system dynamics. We're also doing an agent-based simulation as well. And then we're also doing, we're taking that work and we're optimizing it on the one side, but we're also doing lab experiments. I should say this is planned with Professor Figge, who is one of our participants, to try to understand, okay, we've got optimal on one side, that's cool. What do people really do on the other? And then based on that, maybe we can teach people what sorts of metrics, what sorts of strategies can be done to get closer to optimal. And the last stream I'm working on is learning from placing apps on rival platforms, which we're tentatively calling complementary learning. We have a paper out on that. It's been submitted to a conference. Professor Figge is part of this as well. And the idea is that we're looking at situations which are like Google Android. Why has Google placed things like Google Maps onto iOS? That seems counterintuitive because they're just making that other platform more successful and perhaps hurting themselves. So there has to be a reason. And there is some evidence that part of the reason for this is because when you put an app in a different platform ecosystem, you learn more about it. You learn more about your customers. And then you can adapt your platform to match that better. Okay. Professor Figge, how am I doing on time?
You maybe have 5 more minutes if you need to.
Okay. So I think at this point, I am going to say, and I think I'll wrap it up at this point, is that on this last research on complementary learning by placing apps onto other platforms, one of the things we've learned is that higher switching costs tend to make this strategy more successful. And that's interesting because from what we can tell from business to business platforms, they tend to have higher switching costs. And that's because the customers and also the suppliers, they have a much higher fixed cost for onboarding to a platform. So because despite all the help that a platform may give them into onboarding, there's still a lot of peculiarities by each firm, and you have to integrate that platform with other solutions you already have, and so on. And so it does have an influence. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. And just summarize. The first thing I talked about is pipes, that is traditional supply chains and platforms. What are the differences? What are the similarities? And the differences are you're going from a linear structure to a triangular structure, but that doesn't mean that the prior literature on supply chains for that pipe structure doesn't apply. And that's really what the bulk of my work right now is concentrating upon. And lastly, I believe, because a lot of the research on those traditional supply chains are about business to business relationships, that this perhaps might be even more true for business to business supply chains than for business to consumer supply chains. And with that, I would like to thank you.